For someone interested in DMing, one of the biggest hooks is the opportunity to create your own custom world. In your setting, you get to create the story you want to tell, the bad guys you want to see thwarted, and the twists you want to pull. There's a lot of content out there explaining how you can get your players into your custom world right away. But I feel like there are a lot of pitfalls that most content creators don't talk about. Pitfalls that first-time world builders might have a lot of trouble with. Hi, I'm Ian from Incendium D&D, and in this video, we're going to be talking about creating your very first custom world in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. One of the best pieces of gaming advice that we've heard has been from the channel Taking 20. Before creating your first custom world, your first country, or even your first village, you'll want to know what the core experience is that you're creating for your players. Many DMs think that this means creating custom magic items or homebrew rules, things that stood out to them in other games that they've played. But this is one of those common pitfalls for new DMs. Core gameplay is all about being clear about what your players are going to experience in a session. Is your game going to be more of an improvisational take on the rules, or are you going to be following rules as written? Is social interaction, exploration, or combat going to be the focus of your games? What about the emotional tone of your story? Is it going to be thoughtful, intense, relaxing? By starting off with specific experiences in mind, you'll have an easier time crafting stories in your world, and it'll be easier to figure out which variant rules or homebrew rules, if any, are going to be appropriate in supporting them. And that's one of the biggest draws to 5th edition, the flexibility of its rule set. As a 5th edition Dungeon Master, you get to choose what kind of story you want to tell. Some people are perfectly happy using rules as written because they understand 5th edition system and can relax knowing that everyone is using the same rules. A gothic horror game, on the other hand, such as Curse of Strahd, might be better supported by deadlier rules, such as natural healing or a healer's kit dependency. These variant rules come from the Dungeon Master's Guide and can make combat feel a lot more dangerous and emphasize the necessity to navigate social interactions in order to prevent combat from breaking out in the first place. A game set in the noir intrigue of Eberron will have a much more morally complex plot, whereas the black and white morality of Faerun won't have your players questioning who the good and bad guys are. Using specific mechanics reinforces the combat's tone. For example, in my world, I prefer thoughtful combat. I like combat to be an exchange between the players and their opponents. Tactical combat strategies are encouraged through rules like Sunder and Facing in order to create more meaningful choices. By having these in front of you, it'll help set a clear vision when creating your world for your players to play in. Next, you should develop your game's aesthetic. Aesthetics complement your world's setting and its core gameplay. A lot of novice world builders actually start with this in mind, and it's okay to be inspired by other worlds and get excited about that. However, many DMs create detailed descriptions and then undercut those descriptions with inaccurate or inadequate gameplay rulings. This leaves the aesthetic feeling shallow, even if you put a lot of effort and time into the descriptions that you've made. I've run into this problem myself, actually. For example, a lot of DMs want to create low magic settings because they feel like magic is a solution that is way too easy to use to solve many puzzles and problems. To make this choice in game design feel more worthwhile, you might consider adding some peripheral conditions to using magic in your world, such as creating cultural taboos surrounding it. Sure, you could cast a spell to circumvent a problem, but it will create consequences if somebody catches you doing it.
No, you maniac! What are you doing? Only a fool would play God!
This can take a lot of pressure off of you as the Dungeon Master, and it encourages players to think outside of the magic box, as it were. This kind of theme can also help you develop the lore to support it. By starting with the core gameplay, thoughtful puzzles, and less magic, you can really flesh out that aesthetic you're looking for. As a world builder, you need to be okay with drafts. Any seasoned game designer will attest that you're not going to get it perfect on the first try. I've run through 3 iterations of my custom world myself. Game design, which is what you're doing when you world build as a DM, requires iteration after iteration, and a lot of your ideas probably won't survive the playtesting stage. Some people will advise that you start with a village and work your way out from there. I've tried this myself and had some good results, but as I began filling in the gaps in my world, I began asking myself more and more questions about how everything really is interconnected. It helps when my players also ask those questions of me. And so I came to the conclusion that in order to frame your world well, you might choose to start with a few continents or a few countries. This doesn't mean you need to know a lot about the macroeconomics or the microeconomics or anything like that, but you can think about the dynamics between these countries and how they affect the rest of the world. And of course, it does come back to your core gameplay. You don't need to start with a few countries, you don't need to start with a few villages. It really depends on what you're looking for at the table. If you're the type of DM to enjoy political intrigue, you might start out with a few factions or nations. But if you're a DM that prefers to dungeon crawl, you wouldn't need to flesh out that overworld too much. Your players aren't going to be seeing it anyway, and by leaving a lot to the imagination, the players will be free to fill in their own gaps. All of this really depends on what you chose in the first step. But regardless of how you choose to express your core gameplay, just remember, less is more. I've found the most success in treating my custom world as a kind of framework with a lot of gaps to be filled in, and leaving many questions that may not have clear answers for my players. This makes the players feel like they have a lot more agency, and that they can impact the world even as you present it to them, instead of just being voyeurs. Start with the bare bones of your world, and then let their imagination fill in the rest. Of course, this doesn't mean that they have absolute creative freedom over it, not like you do. But if you've built up enough trust between yourself and your players, this will encourage them to color inside the lines of your setting. When confronted with thought-provoking questions, your players might come up with some interesting answers that you might like. It's really exciting for everyone to figure out something at the table, even if you don't have something in the canon lined up for them. To reiterate, less is more. You don't have to change or include everything from the default D&D setting.
Blasphemy! He said it again!
Here's a trap that I've fallen for in my time as a world builder as well. A lot of novice world builders will try to subvert expectations by changing every single thing, every race, every class, every mechanic that they can think of in order to surprise their players. Let's take the dwarves for example. Just because they're minors in the player's handbook, Faerun, and Dragonlance doesn't mean that they can't be minors in your world too. Changing things doesn't automatically make it more exciting. Sure, it might be a novel idea for dwarves to be part of a sailing culture or live in the swamp somewhere, but this change won't automatically make your world feel more compelling. Likewise, you may not want to include every aspect of D&D in your world. If you don't want to use Dragonborn or Tieflings, that's okay. I found it really helpful when first starting out to practice making a compelling world with 1 or 2 changes while leaving the rest as details for your players to recognize from the default setting. When players see familiar things in your custom world, it'll be easier for them to suspend their disbelief and immerse themselves in their character. For races, I really recommend choosing a handful that catch your eye. Maybe half-elves are exceedingly rare in your world, or maybe most NPCs are human. Maybe there are no elves in your world, and maybe you only have orcs, tieflings, and dragonborn. I know I recommended not to subvert expectations too much, but by choosing just a few, it creates an interesting and unique flavor for your setting. For classes, you might think less about changing the archetypes from the PHB, and be more interested in where these classes came up in your world. Is wizardry older than sorcery? Which culture is known for making the best fighters? Are there any druids in your world at all? Small changes like this can really tie things together. And of course, remember that this doesn't mean you can't change things later. Again, be comfortable with the first iteration just being another draft. I mean, just look at Matt Mercer's Tal'Darai. You should practice saying both yes and no. Many expert DMs out there have mastered this technique, and keeping a careful balance between the two will help enhance the drama of the story you're trying to tell. Creating a satisfying world doesn't start and stop with the preparation you make before you start your game. There will be times that your players come up with interesting and unique backgrounds that you hadn't even thought of, and saying yes during these times can lead to deeper, more meaningful gameplay in the long run. It makes them feel like they're really part of the world. In contrast, some players will come up with really goofy ideas that undercut the tone of the game that you're going for. For example, in a horror game. Saying no during these times will help maintain the integrity of your game so that you and your players can get the most out of it. This lets your players know that they matter to your world just as your world matters to them. Just don't pull the no trigger too often or they'll feel like their actions don't matter. And that's what I've got for you today. World building should be exciting for both the players and the DMs, and by being mindful about the choices you make, you'll end up with a satisfying and more fulfilling result. So I've got a couple of questions for you. DMs, if you had something that you could tell your past self about world building, what would it be? Players, what's a moment that you really felt immersed in the world you were playing in? If you like this video, let YouTube know by pressing like, subscribe, and ringing that notification bell. That way you'll get notified whenever we upload more content like this. We really appreciate everybody who's brought us this far. It means a lot. We've had a small uptick in subscribers and the support you guys are showing is awesome. With all that said, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and I'll catch you guys next time.